She looked at him the way people look at someone who has wandered into the wrong building. Politely, but with that particular stillness behind the eyes that meant she'd already made up her mind. He was standing at the entrance of the Harrington Grand Hotel in Louisville, wearing a faded gray canvas jacket with a small streak of engine grease near the left pocket that he'd noticed somewhere on the highway and decided was not worth stopping for. His boots had seen mud and concrete and the underside of more cars than he could count. He was holding the hand of a 9-year-old girl who wore one yellow sock and one striped one and carried a turtle-shaped backpack that was almost as big as she was. And the woman in the navy blazer was already touching her earpiece before he'd said a single word. What happened in the next 40 minutes was recorded by a retired school teacher from Lexington who'd been sitting in the lobby waiting for her daughter. She posted the video that night with a caption that said simply, "Watch what this hotel did to this man and his little girl." By morning, it had been seen by 11 million people. By the end of the week, the number had stopped meaning anything to the woman who posted it. But that came later. Grady Norris was 41 years old. He'd spent the first 15 years of his career as a lead systems engineer at Wentworth Automotive in Detroit, designing the kinds of engine calibration systems that most drivers never think about, but that determine whether a car runs clean or runs rough, whether it's efficient or wasteful, whether it lasts. He'd been good at it. He'd been the kind of good where people stopped arguing with him in meetings, because the numbers always came back the way he said they would. Then his wife Camille got sick, and then she died. And Grady, at 35, found himself in a 2-bedroom house in Millhaven, Kentucky, a town of 9,000 people in the eastern part of the state, with a 4-year-old daughter named Nell and a decision to make about what the rest of his life was going to look like. He'd taken over the garage on Ellison Street from a retired mechanic named Hugh who'd been looking to sell for 2 years. It was not a lucrative business. It was a small, honest one, which suited Grady in a way that the corporate life had stopped suiting him around the time he realized the thing he wanted most was to be home before dark. He still designed. He couldn't stop doing that any more than he could stop breathing. In the back of the garage, past the hydraulic lift and the parts shelves, he had a workbench with 3 monitors and a set of notebooks that looked, to anyone who glanced at them, like the private language of someone very strange. Over 3 years, working nights after Nell went to bed, and Saturdays when she was at her grandmother's, he had developed an engine calibration system that was, he believed, and his notebooks proved, about 15 years ahead of anything currently in production. He had not gone looking for Raymond Chu. Raymond Chu had found him through a patent he'd filed 18 months earlier and a technical paper he'd posted quietly on an engineering forum under his own name. Chu was 63 years old, the CEO of Meridian Drive Systems, one of the largest automotive components companies in the country. He had a reputation for recognizing things before other people understood what they were looking at. The meeting at the Harrington was Chu's idea. A full-day, penthouse conference suite, lawyers on both sides, the kind of meeting where you put a number on a table and see what the other person does with it. Grady had driven up from Millhaven that morning, a little over 2 hours. He'd brought Nell because her fall break had started and his mother-in-law, who was Nell's usual backup, had come down with a sinus infection. Nell had asked if she could see a hotel with a real chandelier, and the Harrington had one in the lobby that was written up in 3 different travel publications, so Grady had told her yes. She'd worn her best jeans and her yellow and striped sock combination, which she'd chosen herself, and which he'd decided was not worth arguing about. He'd come straight from the garage because the morning had run long, a brake job he'd promised to finish before he left, a customer counting on him. He'd washed his hands twice, but the jacket was what it was. The woman at the entrance was named Renee Ashford. She was 32, the hotel's director of guest experience, which was the title given to the person responsible for ensuring that the Harrington's lobby looked and felt and functioned the way expensive places are supposed to. She was good at her job in the way that people are good at things they've been doing long enough to do them without thinking. She saw Grady cross the threshold with Nell. She registered his jacket. She registered his boots. She registered the child with the turtle backpack. And in the 4 seconds before he reached the welcome desk, she arrived at a conclusion that she didn't bother to examine because it felt self-evident. "Good morning," she said. "Are you here for the service entrance?" "That's around to the left, off the parking structure." Grady stopped. "I'm a guest," he said. "Norris. Grady Norris. I have a meeting on 17. She looked at her tablet. She scrolled. The expression she wore was not unkind. It was the specific expression of someone performing thoroughness while having already made up their mind. "I'm not seeing a reservation under that name." "The suite is booked through Meridian Drive Systems," Grady said. "Raymond Chu's company. I can give you his assistant's name if that helps." Renee looked at him again, not at the tablet, at him. "I'll need to verify," she said. "If you could wait just." "Dad," Nell said quietly. She was looking up at Renee with the particular solemn attention of a 9-year-old who has noticed that the adults around her are behaving strangely and is not sure yet what to make of it. "Why do we have to wait?" "We're guests." "I know," Grady said. He didn't look away from Renee. "Take your time," he told her. "We'll be right here." What followed was 22 minutes that nobody in that lobby forgot. Renee made 2 calls. Both of them went to people who gave her the answer she seemed to want rather than the one that was accurate, which Grady would only understand later, much later, when he learned what had been done to his reservation file. At the time, he only knew that the calls were taking longer than they should have. He stood near the center of the lobby, with Nell beside him, her hand in his, and he looked at the chandelier she'd wanted to see. It was extraordinary. 10,000 crystals arranged in 3 descending tiers, each one catching the light from a different angle. He pointed it out to her, and she tipped her head back and stared up at it with the focused wonder that children bring to things they've decided are worth their full attention. He had not raised his voice. He had not demanded anything. He had stood there because there was nowhere to go and nothing to do but wait, and because Nell was watching him, and he intended to give her something worth watching. When 2 hotel security officers arrived at the lobby entrance, politely, uncertainly, clearly not entirely sure why they'd been called, Grady's face did not change. He recognized the situation. He'd been in difficult negotiations long enough to recognize the moment when something has gone off script and nobody in the room knows how to recalibrate. "There's been a miscommunication," he told the officers, and his voice was even and unhurried, the voice of a man who was doing arithmetic in his head and finding the result more interesting than alarming. "I'm happy to wait while we sort it out." Nell looked up at the security officers, then at her father. "Are those guys going to make us leave?" she said. "No," Grady said. "Are you sure?" "Yeah," he said. "I'm sure." He wasn't entirely sure, but she was 9 and she needed to hear certainty, and that was the kind of math he could do without thinking. Raymond Chu stepped off the elevator at 10:47, looking like a man who had been interrupted mid-sentence and had not appreciated it. He was 63, 5'8", wearing a dark suit and the expression of someone who runs a company with 6,000 employees and has very limited patience for wasted time. He crossed the lobby in 11 seconds. "Grady," he said, and shook his hand. Then he looked at Renee. "This is the man whose calibration patent my company has been trying to license for 2 years," he said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. He has a reserved suite on the 17th floor. He is, as of right now, the most important meeting I have this quarter. He paused. "Is there something I can help clarify?" The lobby was very quiet. Renee looked at Chu. She looked at Grady. She looked at his jacket and his boots and the child with the turtle backpack, who was looking back at her with those clear, serious eyes. And she understood, all at once, what she'd done, not gradually, not in stages. All at once, the way understanding sometimes works when you've been avoiding something that is, in the end, unavoidable. "No," she said very quietly. "No, I apologize, Mr. Norris. I owe you an apology, please." She gestured toward the elevator. "Let me walk you up." "Thank you," Grady said, and nothing else. The retired schoolteacher's video was 51 minutes long. She had not meant to record it. She'd started filming when she realized the situation was developing in a direction she hadn't expected, and she'd kept filming because she didn't know when it would end. The clip that spread was a compressed version. 7 minutes that included Renee's initial interaction with Grady, Nell asking why they had to wait, the security officers arriving, and Raymond Chu's appearance. And then, at the very end, the moment that got clipped and shared more than anything else. Grady crouching down beside Nell after Renee walked away, and Nell saying, "What did she think we were?" And Grady saying, quietly enough that the microphone almost didn't catch it, she thought she already knew. She was wrong. That exchange was seen 40 million times in 72 hours. The comment sections filled with people who recognized themselves. Not in Grady, necessarily, though many did, but in the specific architecture of the moment. The way a person can be looked at and categorized in 4 seconds. The way that categorization closes doors before you've had a chance to walk through them. The particular humiliation of being made to feel like an intruder somewhere you have every right to be. Some of them, if they were honest, recognized themselves in Renee. Renee Ashford had been awake since 2 in the morning when her phone started ringing with calls she didn't answer. By 6, she had seen the video. By 7, she had read enough of the comments to understand the shape of what had happened, even if the specific geometry of it was still unclear to her. She sat in her apartment with her coffee going cold and thought about the 4 seconds. The jacket, the boots, the child, the conclusion she had reached before he'd opened his mouth, and how fast she'd reached it, and how completely she'd trusted it. She had done her job. That was the thing she kept returning to. She had looked at a situation and made a professional assessment and acted on it. Except the assessment had been wrong in a way that had nothing to do with professionalism. It had been wrong in a way that was entirely uncomfortably personal. A reflex so ingrained she hadn't noticed it running until she saw herself on a stranger's phone screen doing the thing she had just done. She called her operations manager at 8. "I need to know who modified the reservation record for the Norris booking," she said. "I want the timestamp, and I want the account that made the change." What Grady did not know, as he sat in the penthouse conference suite across from Raymond Chu, while the deal that would change his life moved through its careful, measured stages, was that his reservation had been tampered with. The VIP status notation had been removed. His name had been reclassified as a logistics contact, the kind of designation given to vendors and supply staff, the kind that would make any attentive guest experience director pause. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone who knew he was coming, knew the time, knew what the meeting was about, and understood that a man arriving in a worn jacket with grease on his sleeve could be made, with the smallest adjustment to a database, to look like exactly what Renee had assumed he was. The name that surfaced when Renee's operations team spent 3 days pulling access logs was Teresa Good. Teresa was 29, a reservations coordinator who had worked at the Harrington for 2 years. She said she'd received an email from someone she understood to be a corporate hospitality liaison at a company called Varon Group Advisors. She said the email had reclassified the Norris booking as part of a standard vendor coordination process. She said she hadn't questioned it because the email was formatted correctly and came from an address that looked legitimate. Varon Group Advisors did not appear to have a website. It did appear to have a registered address in Nashville and a corporate filing date of 14 months ago. The money connecting Varon Group to Teresa Good came out over the following 10 days. Quarterly payments totaling $68,000 over a little more than a year, categorized as consulting fees for hospitality industry insight. The company funding Varon Group was a private investment firm called Paragon Capital Holdings. Paragon Capital Holdings was the primary financial vehicle of a man named Dalton Frey. Frey was 56, based in Atlanta, and had spent 20 years assembling a portfolio of automotive components companies by acquiring smaller competitors during periods of vulnerability and folding them into his larger operations. He had pursued Grady's calibration patent through back channels for the better part of a year and had been told twice that Grady was not interested in selling to Paragon, only in licensing to a company that would commit to domestic manufacturing and profit sharing with his employees. Frey had then attempted to position himself as a co-investor in the Meridian Norris deal. Raymond Chu's team had declined. Frey had, it appeared, decided that if he couldn't have the technology and couldn't disrupt the deal through legitimate means, he could disrupt the meeting. He had calculated, correctly, that Grady Norris would show up looking like a man who fixes cars in a small town. He had calculated, correctly, that this was the kind of appearance that could be turned into a liability with the right manipulation of a single database field. And he had calculated incorrectly that Grady would respond to public humiliation the way Frey would have responded to it. He had bet on a man's temper and lost. Renee's public statement went out on a Thursday, 12 days after the video. She posted it herself, from her personal account, not the hotel's. Her communications team had advised her against the specific language she used. She had thanked them and used it anyway. She wrote that she had looked at a man and a child and made a decision about who they were before she had any information about who they were. She wrote that she had acted on that decision in a way that was wrong. Not mistaken, wrong, because a mistake sounds like something that happened to her, and this was something she had done. She wrote that she was not using the word bias as an excuse, because the word can be used to soften a thing that doesn't deserve to be softened. She was writing it as a description of a mechanism she had let run unchecked, and that she intended to examine. She wrote 2 paragraphs about Nell. They were the most carefully written paragraphs she'd ever produced, and they said less than she felt, which was the closest she could get to honesty. The statement was read more widely than the video. Grady read it on his phone in the garage, oil under his fingernails, a half-reassembled carburetor on the bench in front of him. He read it twice. He set the phone down and finished the carburetor. Then he called Colleen, his business manager, and said, "Don't respond publicly. Give it a few days." "You're not angry," Colleen said. He thought about it. "I'm something," he said, "but it's not useful right now." The investigation that began with Renee's internal audit ended 8 weeks later, with federal charges filed against Dalton Frey and 2 associates at Paragon Capital Holdings. Wire fraud, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, and computer fraud under the CFAA for the unauthorized modification of the hotel's guest database. Teresa Good had cooperated with investigators under a separate arrangement. The financial chain was, as the prosecutor's office described it in a brief filed in March, substantially complete. Grady did not follow the proceedings closely. He had given everything his legal team needed and stepped back, the way you step back from a fire you've built in the right place and trust to do what fire does. The licensing agreement with Meridian Drive Systems closed on a Wednesday afternoon in November, in a conference room in Cincinnati with 8 people present and a bottle of champagne that nobody opened immediately because Raymond Chu believed in finishing the paperwork first. The agreement was worth, over its 15-year term, somewhere north of $50 million. Grady had structured it with manufacturing commitments and a revenue-sharing provision for a foundation he had been planning for 3 years and had not yet launched. He launched it in the spring. The event was held at the Millhaven Community Center, which was not a glamorous venue. Grady had been offered 2 different conference facilities in Louisville and a ballroom in Lexington, and had said no to all of them because the scholarship recipients lived in eastern Kentucky and western Virginia and the Appalachian foothills, and he wanted the foundation's first night to happen somewhere that felt like where it was from. There were 180 people in the room. The scholarship recipients were 8 young people from rural communities who had demonstrated exceptional aptitude in engineering, physics, or technical trades, and had not, for reasons that had nothing to do with their abilities, found a clear path forward. 3 of them were the children of single parents. 2 of them had worked at auto shops. 1 of them had been told by a high school counselor that engineering was not a realistic goal. Grady's remarks ran 9 minutes. He had written them over several weeks, revising each time he found a sentence that sounded like a speech rather than something he would actually say. The version he delivered still had one place where he stopped, looked at the ceiling for a half second, and said, "Let me say that differently." Nobody in the room appeared to mind. He talked about driving up to Louisville in October, straight from the garage, jacket and all. He talked about standing in a marble lobby while someone decided in 4 seconds what he was. He didn't say this with bitterness. He said it the way you describe the weather, as a thing that happens, as a fact about the world that you've decided to use rather than resent. He said he had stood there because the alternative was to become something that would have scared his daughter. He talked about Camille, just briefly, just honestly. He said she had been an electrician in Detroit who worked 60-hour weeks while taking online courses for her engineering certification, and that the day she passed her exam he had cried in a way he had told exactly no one about. He said the foundation existed because she would have understood what it was for without being told. He paused there. The room let him. Then Nell climbed the 3 steps to the stage and walked to where he was standing with her particular 9-year-old's lack of ceremony, as if this were a perfectly ordinary thing to do in the middle of a speech. She looked up at him. "Dad," she said. The microphone caught it. "Yeah." At the hotel. She was not asking if he remembered. She knew he remembered. She was asking for something she'd been sitting with for 5 months. "Why didn't you yell at that lady?" The room was very still. Grady looked at his daughter. He was aware that 180 people were listening, and he was also aware that the only person he was answering was the one standing in front of him. "Because you were there," he said, "and I knew you were watching." Nell considered this. But if I wasn't there? He thought about it, genuinely, visibly thought about it, the way he thought through things at his workbench. I'd like to think I still would have handled it the same way," he said. "But honestly, having you there made it easier. It gave me something bigger to be in charge of than my own feelings." Nell absorbed this. "Were you scared?" "No." "Were you mad?" "Yeah," he said. "But mad is a fire that burns your own house down if you don't direct it somewhere useful. So I just waited and let the truth catch up." She appeared to find this satisfactory. She nodded once, the way she nodded when the answer to a math problem turned out to be cleaner than expected. Then she walked back off the stage and returned to her seat in the front row, where she pulled out a book about deep-sea fish and resumed her previous activity. The room started clapping. Renee Ashford was in the audience. She'd asked, through a brief email to Grady's business manager, whether her presence would be inappropriate. She had received a reply within a day that said simply, "You're welcome to come." She sat in the 8th row. She was not dressed to be recognized. She had driven from Louisville alone, arriving 20 minutes early, and had chosen a seat where she could see Grady's face without being visible to him in any prominent way. She had called him once 6 weeks after the video, after she had the Varen Group documentation in hand and understood what had been constructed and how she had been used in it. She had told him everything, the access logs, the payments, the name of the firm, before her own lawyers knew she was making the call, because she had decided that protecting her exposure was a smaller concern than making sure he had what he needed. He had been quiet on the phone for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me." Now she sat in the 8th row and watched him talk about Camille, and watched Nell walk onto the stage and ask her questions, and watched Grady answer them with the unmanaged honesty of someone who had decided somewhere along the way to stop performing composure and just have it. When he said mad is a fire that burns your own house down, she wrote it on the inside cover of the program in her lap. Not because it was a quote, because it was the thing she'd been trying to find words for since October. After the ceremony, she waited near the side exit while the room settled into smaller conversations. She was not positioning herself. She simply wasn't ready to leave yet. Grady found her 20 minutes later crossing the room with the deliberate ease of someone who had spotted her earlier and had been working his way over in between the dozen handshakes and introductions that follow events like this. "You came," he said. "I wanted to hear it in person," she said, "the real version." He looked at her for a moment. "Is it what you expected?" "No," she paused. "You're more patient than I thought you'd be with all of it." "Patience is easier when you're not angry," he said. "And I stopped being angry at you a while ago." He said it the way he said most things, without qualification, like a fact about the weather. She looked down at the program in her hand, at the line she'd written. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." At the hotel, after Chu came down, she chose her words carefully. "You could have said more, right there, in front of everyone. You could have made it much worse for me." She looked at him. "Why didn't you?" Grady thought about it, not performing the thinking, actually doing it. "Nell was there," he said, "and I didn't want her to see me take something from someone who was already losing. That's not the kind of man I want her to think her father is." He paused. "Also, you figured out the Varen thing on your own. You didn't wait for someone to make you look. You looked." He shrugged, not dismissively, just the gesture of a man stating what is. "That's worth something." She met his eyes. I was used, she said, but I didn't have to be usable. He looked at her steadily. No, he said, you didn't. And then quieter, but you're looking at it now. That's the actual thing. Nell appeared from somewhere behind Grady, with the instantaneous quality she seemed to have perfected, materializing at his elbow as if she'd been there all along. She looked at Renee with the frank assessment of a child organizing available information. You're the hotel lady, she said. Yes, Renee said. Nell studied her for a moment, not with hostility, with the same focused attention she'd given to the chandelier. You said sorry, she said. Back at the hotel. I did. Are you better now? Nell asked, at not doing that. The directness of it was startling. It was also, Renee thought, exactly the right question. Not have you suffered enough. Not has the appropriate amount of time passed. Simply, are you better now? I'm working on it, Renee said. I think so, but I won't really know for a while. Nell considered this. Okay, she said, apparently finding it acceptable. Then, to Grady, Dad, they still have the little sandwiches. Can I get more? How many have you already had? She held up 4 fingers with the expression of someone who understands this is not an ideal number and is hoping it will be overlooked given the circumstances. Grady looked at her for a long moment. 2 more, he said, and then we're leaving. She turned and disappeared back into the crowd. He watched the space where she'd been. Something in his face, unguarded for just a moment, carried the specific weight of a parent who has been watching a child carry something difficult for 5 months and has finally, in a community center on a spring evening, seen her set most of it down. She asked me about you, he said, about a week after it happened. Renee looked at him. What did she ask? If you were a bad person. He looked at the middle distance. I told her you were a person who'd made a bad choice, that those were different things. He glanced back at her. She thought about it for a second and said, okay. Then she asked if we could get ice cream. Renee felt something shift in her chest that she hadn't known was there. Thank you, she said, for telling her that. It was true, he said simply. Outside the community center, the Kentucky spring had produced the kind of evening that felt like a beginning rather than an ending. Cool air, a sky going dark at the edges, the neighborhood settling into its regular nighttime sounds around a building that had briefly held something larger than its usual purposes. Renee drove home through Millhaven and then north toward Louisville with the program on the passenger seat and the line she'd written on its inside cover. The highway was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like permission to think. She had not felt redeemed when she left that room. Redemption implied a finished state, and she was not finished. There was still work, the kind that doesn't announce itself and doesn't come with applause, the kind you do when no one is counting. She had spent 5 months making it systematically easier for people in her hotel to tell her the truth, and she had learned that this was harder than she'd expected and also more necessary than she'd understood. She was not done learning it, but she was better than she'd been in October, and better was not nothing. Better was, in fact, the only direction that mattered. Grady found Nell at the food table, with a plate containing, by any reasonable estimate, considerably more than 2 sandwiches. He looked at the plate. He looked at her. They refilled them, she said, with the calm certainty of someone who has identified a loophole and is prepared to defend it. Nell. I waited until they refilled. That's technically the start of a new round. He studied her. She looked back at him with her mother's eyes and her own particular flavor of logic, and absolutely no sign of backing down. That's not how that works, he said. I think it might be, she said. He stood there for a moment, longer than was necessary. Then he sat down next to her and stole one of the sandwiches off her plate. She let him. That was how he knew she'd expected to lose the argument. Around them, the room continued, the scholarship recipients talking with engineers and mentors and program coordinators, conversations beginning that would, in the slow accumulating way of real things, eventually become opportunities and introductions and the specific altered circumstances of lives that had needed exactly this door to open at exactly this time. Grady watched it for a while without saying anything. The room sounded like possibility, which is a specific kind of sound if you know to listen for it. Not loud, not certain, but present in a way that has weight to it. Ready? He said. Nell finished the sandwich in her hand. She looked around the room once, the same considering look she gave to most things worth remembering. Yeah, she said. Okay. He took her hand, and they walked toward the exit, past the chandelier photos someone had taped to the entryway wall as a joke. Nell had apparently mentioned the Harrington chandelier to the event organizer, who had printed 3 pictures of chandeliers from the internet and taped them next to the door with a handwritten sign that read, as requested. Nell stopped in front of them on the way out. They're not as good as the real one, she said. No, Grady agreed, they're not. She looked at them for another second, with the seriousness she reserved for things she was committing to memory. Then she pushed through the door and into the evening, pulling him gently by the hand, and the night outside was cool and dark, and full of the ordinary sounds of a small town going about its business in all the usual ways, none of it knowing, none of it needing to know, that what had started in a hotel lobby in October, with a 4-second judgment and a wrong conclusion, had ended here, in a parking lot in a town of 9,000 people, with a man and his daughter walking to their car in the dark, her turtle backpack bouncing with each step, the spring air around them, carrying the faint smell of something growing. Sandwiches tomorrow? Nell said. We have food at home. That's not what I asked. He looked down at her. Maybe, he said. She considered this. I'll take it, she said, and kept walking, and the night held them both the way nights do, without ceremony, without judgment, without any awareness at all of what it meant that they were still here, still moving forward, still choosing, as they had on an October morning in a marble lobby, to be exactly who they were.